To an average person, a motorsport like Formula 1 does not sound like a very sustainable sport. The nature of it is racing cars, and it seems everything about F1 emits CO2. But compared to other sports, Formula 1 does not have a very big impact on the environment. And to show that it cares about sustainability, F1 has even announced that it aims to be net zero carbon by 2030. But how can a sport which in its core is about racing cars reach a zero carbon footprint? Well, this objective isn't unrealistic at all. Formula E, a motorsport which uses electric cars and is from the same governing body as F1, the FIA, has already managed to reach a zero carbon footprint. But the cars themselves have very little to do with this. In Formula 1, the cars are only responsible for less than 1% of the carbon emission, most of it coming from logistics and travel. So there is no reason for F1 not to be able to replicate Formula E's achievement. It is important to understand that a net zero carbon footprint is not the same as zero carbon emissions, the difference being that you can utilize offsets to lower your carbon footprint. An offset is an action which takes out carbon emissions elsewhere, like investing in renewable energy and planting trees. These actions are meant to counteract your own carbon emissions, and this is a large part of how Formula E managed to reach a zero carbon footprint so quickly. Now here's the problem. Offsetting is not ideal, as there is still carbon being emitted. So preferably, offsetting should only be used to take out emissions that are unavoidable. Formula 1 seems to understand this, as they have shown many ways they wanted to reduce their emissions. As of today, Formula 1 is planning to make all of their factories and facilities powered by renewable energy. They also announced that all their events will be completely sustainable by 2025. Now unfortunately, the travel and logistics cannot be completely sustainable without offsetting, and they are also the two things which produce the most emissions in Formula 1. Formula 1 takes place on 5 different continents, and each race, every team brings around 80 to 100 people alongside all of their equipment and parts. However, their emissions could still be greatly reduced. For instance, the distance between each race is a lot longer than it needs to be. To fix this issue, Formula 1 is planning to introduce a smarter calendar where all the races from the same region will be following each other instead of traveling from continent to continent so often. When it comes to the travels, Formula 1 did not announce any specific plan to reduce emissions because they really need all of their staff and team members attending each race. But because of COVID-19, they were forced to adapt and find a way to send as few people as possible to each race in order to minimize travels. For example, the broadcasting team, which contains approximately 200 to 300 people, previously went to each race, but this season, a large part of it stayed in the UK and found a way to do the whole broadcast remotely. The intention of doing this was, of course, to reduce the amount of people traveling to fit the COVID-19 restrictions, but it also reduced their carbon emissions, and they might as well keep doing this in the future. This is how they are planning to reduce their direct emissions, but there is also one massive factor which isn't taken into account in their carbon footprint. That is, the fans coming to each races. Thousands and thousands of fans come to each race to watch their favorite driver, 50% of which come from overseas. Carbon emissions from the other factors are almost insignificant compared to the ones of the fans which come to the races. So even though it's not counted in their carbon footprint, Formula 1 will introduce some tools to give fans a greener way to reach races, an opportunity for local people to come to the races by 2025 as part of their sustainable event strategy. Finally, Formula 1 has announced that they will make their cars completely sustainable. They already produce the most efficient hybrid engines, which convert 50% of the fuel compared to around 20 to 30% for normal road cars. And their objective is to produce the 100% sustainable engine, using a mix of their hybrid engine technology and a sustainable fuel which they are developing. But as I already mentioned, the cars were a very small part of their carbon footprint. So why should they even bother make their cars more sustainable if they account for such a small percentage of their carbon emissions? Well, although the cars themselves are not what create the largest part of their carbon emission, ignoring the factor of sustainability in the cars would be completely missing out on the whole purpose of Formula 1. F1 has always been in line with the state of the automobile world, innovating where needed to in speed, safety, and efficiency. But now, sustainability is becoming just as big as these three aspects in the automobile industry. Some countries are planning to ban the sale of gasoline and diesel cars, coincidentally, in 2030. and most car manufacturers are beginning to make hybrid and electric, more sustainable cars. By making their cars more sustainable, Formula One can have a much bigger impact on the environment than they ever could by just focusing on their carbon footprint. Their engines and fuel could be adapted to road cars, and this could have some real-world benefits, outside of just making faster cars. This initiative should be good news for anyone who follows Formula One. A lot of companies have also made plans to be net zero carbon, but not all of them have made a clear plan as to what they would do to reduce their emissions, outside of just offsetting. With this initiative, Formula One has made it clear that they are eager to reduce their emissions as much as possible, and benefit the world with its innovation. And this should be an example, not for just other motorsport, but for every sports league, as the sustainable challenges that Formula One are facing are the same for every sport.